The magic of midnight. The town of Gloam had always carried a certain weight, an undercurrent of mystery woven into its cobblestone streets and ancient oak trees. Nestled deep in a valley perpetually kissed by mist, it was a place where secrets lingered and time seemed reluctant to move forward. On this particular evening, the air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken anticipation. As the hour drew near, the stillness of the town sharpened. Streetlights flickered, their glow pulsing faintly, as though they too awaited something extraordinary. The clock tower, a looming relic from centuries past, stood silent but watchful in the town square. For years, its hands had barely managed to mark the hours, but tonight they moved with unnerving precision. Eleanor, the keeper of the small, dusty bookstore on Ash Lane, noticed the shift first. She stood by the window, her mug of tea cooling in her hands. The faint shimmer outside caught her eye. It wasn't snow, nor the soft glow of fireflies that sometimes wandered down from the woods. It was something else, something alive. In the mechanic's workshop, Jacob wiped grease from his hands, his radio static-filled and distant. He frowned, his usual comfort in the hum of machines disrupted by an unfamiliar vibration that resonated through his tools. Spanners trembled, bolts rolled unprompted across the workbench. He glanced toward the window and froze, the faint glimmer of sparks outside catching his attention. Across town, little Maisie sat on the edge of her bed, wide-eyed. She hadn't spoken in years, her voice locked away by an illness no doctor could explain. But tonight, she felt a stirring in her chest, a strange warmth that bubbled up to her throat. The curtains on her window fluttered despite the absence of wind, and she saw the sparks too, tiny, radiant and purposeful, as if searching for something. The clock struck 11:55. In the square, beneath the towering shadow of the clock tower, a figure moved. Cloaked and silent, they walked a deliberate path, their boots crunching softly against the frost-laden ground. No one saw them, though the town's inhabitants, each in their own way, felt the figure's presence like a whisper brushing against their minds. With slow precision, the figure knelt, tracing sigils into the frozen earth. Their gloved fingers left trails of faint golden light. The sigils pulsed as the figure's voice, low and melodic, broke the silence. For the worthy and the lost, may the sparks of the beyond awaken destiny. At the stroke of midnight, the world seemed to hold its breath. The first chime echoed across Gloam, low and resonant, shaking the leaves from trees and sending ripples through puddles. By the second chime, the stars above shimmered unnaturally bright, their light descending like a cascade of falling embers. With the third chime, the sparks scattered. Eleanor gasped as one drifted through her window, landing gently on the orchid by her desk. The withered petals unfurled, vibrant purple veins glowing with life. Her pulse quickened as the sparks sank into the soil. the plant now alive with a strange, otherworldly energy. In his garage, Jacob stumbled backward as the tools around him began to move, floating as if carried by unseen hands. They aligned themselves in perfect rows, each bolt and nut slotting into place without his command. He reached out hesitantly, and the tools obeyed, spinning and assembling before his very eyes. Maisie felt her lips move, the words spilling forth unbidden. Shadows danced across her walls, twisting and curling in response. She giggled, her voice clear and musical, a sound her parents, standing frozen in the doorway, hadn't heard in years. In the square, the cloaked figure stood, their work complete. They raised their hooded head toward the stars, watching as the sparks found their hosts. When the last one disappeared, they whispered again, though this time their words were carried only by the wind. The time has come. Let the choice begin. The town of Gloam, quiet and unassuming only moments ago, now pulsed with unbridled magic. Midnight had come, and with it, the promise of change. The air in Gloam shimmered like a forgotten memory, its streets alive with the quiet hum of latent power. Eleanor stepped outside her bookstore, the newly blooming orchid clutched to her chest. She glanced up and down Ash Lane, but the world seemed deserted. Only the distant echo of the clock tower's chimes reminded her she wasn't alone. A spark floated lazily past her face, its soft golden light casting fleeting shadows. Drawn to its glow, Eleanor reached out instinctively, but the spark darted away as though it had its own purpose. She watched as it veered down the street, weaving through the air toward the square. In the workshop, Jacob sat on the edge of his workbench, his heart pounding. Tools continued to hover in the air, their movements synchronized and deliberate. He couldn't explain it, and he didn't dare try. Instead, he followed the unspoken call he felt in his chest, a gentle tug, like an invisible thread pulling him toward the square. Maisie walked hand in hand with her parents, though it was she who led the way. Her small voice hummed a tune no one could place, yet it stirred emotions her parents couldn't name. Shadows danced in the lamplight, following Maisie's steps like playful companions. Her parents exchanged nervous glances, but didn't question her resolve. They too felt the pull. By the time Eleanor reached the square, she wasn't surprised to find others gathering there. Jacob stood awkwardly near the fountain, his grease-streaked hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Maisie skipped forward, the shadows twirling around her like ribbons. A handful of others trickled in, neighbours, shopkeepers, even the mailman, each with wide eyes and uncertain expressions. At the centre of the square stood the clock tower, its weathered face aglow with an inner light that seemed to pulse in time with Eleanor's heartbeat. The cloaked figure emerged from its shadow, their presence commanding yet eerily silent. Though their face remained obscured, The sparks that danced around them illuminated the edges of a soft smile. "Welcome," the figure said, their voice a melody that resonated in the mind more than the ears. "You have been chosen." A collective murmur rippled through the group. Chosen for what? Eleanor clutched the orchid tighter, its vibrant petals a stark contrast to the unease in her chest. "Why us?" Jacob's voice cut through the tension, rough and unsteady. "What's happening here?" The figure tilted their head, as if the question amused them. "The sparks do not choose lightly," they said. "Each of you has been gifted something extraordinary, a fragment of a greater power. For one night, the mundane shall give way to the miraculous." Eleanor felt a surge of heat in her palms. She glanced down to find the orchid glowing softly, its once brittle stem growing stronger beneath her touch. She looked up, her voice trembling. "And after tonight?" The figure's smile deepened. "At dawn, the magic fades, unless you choose otherwise." The words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Jacob took a step forward, his brow furrowed. "Choose? What kind of choice?" The figure raised a hand, and the sparks that floated in the square gathered around them, forming a constellation of shimmering lights. "To keep your gifts is to pay a price," they said. "A memory, a skill, a dream, something precious must be given in return. But to refuse is to let this moment pass as though it were never yours." Maisie's parents exchanged frantic whispers, but the girl simply watched the figure, her dark eyes unwavering. "What happens if we don't choose?" she asked, her voice small but steady. The figure regarded her for a long moment. "Then the sparks will return to the stars, and your lives will continue as they were. Ordinary, unchanged." A silence settled over the group, thick with uncertainty. Eleanor glanced at the others, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the sparks. She saw fear, wonder, greed, and longing reflected in their eyes. She felt it all herself, a yearning for something more, tangled with the fear of what she might lose. The figure stepped back, their cloak sweeping across the frost-kissed ground. "The choice is yours," they said, their voice softer now, like a distant echo. "But choose wisely. The hour is fleeting, and the dawn waits for no one." As the figure retreated into the shadows of the clock tower, the sparks began to swirl faster, their light intensifying. The townsfolk stood frozen, caught between desire and doubt. Eleanor felt the orchid's petals brush against her fingertips, and she wondered, could she truly go back to the way things were? Above them, the clock tower's hands ticked forward. Midnight was slipping away. The sparks danced, restless and waiting, as if urging them to decide. The square brimmed with unspoken tension. Beneath the golden shimmer of the sparks, the townsfolk hesitated, each grappling with the weight of the cloaked figure's words. Eleanor's breath hung in the frosty air as she turned the orchid in her hands. The flower seemed to glow brighter, its veins pulsing faintly, as though alive with its own awareness. Jacob, restless and uneasy, clenched his fists. Around him, his tools hovered like faithful sentinels, awaiting his command. Maisie's parents stood frozen, but the little girl moved freely, her footsteps drawing the swirling shadows closer. They bent and coiled like dancers, responding to her every motion. It was Maisie who broke the silence. "I think the sparks know what we should do," she said, her voice steady, almost wise. She held out her hand, and a dark wisp coiled around her wrist like a bracelet, shimmering with faint silver light. Eleanor crouched beside her. "Do they tell you anything?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. Maisie shrugged, her small face thoughtful. "Not in words, but I feel them. They're not bad, just waiting." Jacob exhaled sharply. "Waiting for what? For us to give up something we can't get back?" He gestured to the hovering tools, which clattered faintly in response. "This is all wrong. They shouldn't be able to do this." "They shouldn't," Eleanor agreed, her voice thoughtful. "But they can." She turned the orchid over, watching the light dance through its petals. "And we've already been changed by it. The question is whether that change will stay." From the shadows of the clock tower, the cloaked figure's words seemed to echo again. To keep your gifts is to pay a price. A memory, a skill, a dream. Something precious must be given in return. Jacob paced, his boots crunching against the frost. "A price? That's the part no one's talking about. What's worth losing for—" He gestured at the tools floating around him. "This? For a parlor trick that makes me feel like a puppet?" "It's not a trick," Eleanor countered, standing to face him. "It's more than that. You know it is." She motioned toward the sparks, her voice softening. "Whatever this is, it's showing us who we could be." Jacob stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer, but his hands flexed involuntarily, and the tool settled back to the ground with a quiet clink. As if summoned by the rising tension, the sparks began to move. They drifted lazily at first, their golden light flickering, before weaving through the air in deliberate paths. One floated toward Eleanor, another toward Jacob, and another toward Maisie. Others branched out to the gathered townsfolk, each spark finding its host. Eleanor felt the spark press gently against her chest. Warmth spread through her, filling her with a quiet hum of life. The orchid in her hands glowed brighter, its bloom now impossibly vibrant, its scent rich and intoxicating. A vision flashed in her mind. Fields of flowers, green and endless, bursting into bloom with every step she took. Maisie giggled as the shadows around her tightened their embrace. The spark she had caught swirled above her head before sinking into her skin. The shadows pulsed, alive with silvery light, their movements sharper, more deliberate. Maisie waved her hand, and the shadows responded, bending and curling to form shapes. A butterfly, a bird, a tree. Jacob's spark hovered uncertainly, as though sensing his hesitation. When it finally sank into his chest, he flinched. He looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling. Slowly, the tools around him rose again, but this time with greater precision. A wrench twisted mid-air, its grip tightening around an invisible bolt. A screwdriver turned, and Jacob realized he could feel their movements as though they were extensions of his body. The other townsfolk experienced their own transformations. An elderly woman who had been confined to a cane stood tall, her steps spry and purposeful. A young man with a stutter found his voice clear, his words carrying a strange, compelling authority. Each spark awakened something unique, something extraordinary. But the magic wasn't without its edges. Eleanor caught the faraway look in the elderly woman's eyes, the faint tremor in Jacob's hands. Maisie's shadows, though beautiful, flickered with a strange intensity, their shapes unsettling in their sharpness. As the spark settled, the cloaked figure's voice resonated again, though their form remained obscured. The power you hold now is but a fragment of what lies beyond. It reveals your potential, yes, but it also demands a choice. The clock struck 1, the sound reverberating through the square. The cloaked figure stepped forward, their movements fluid and deliberate. "You've seen what you can become," they said, their voice echoing like a melody. "The hour advances. Decide. What are you willing to give for the gift to remain?" Their words lingered in the chilled air, a question as heavy as the night itself. The townsfolk looked at one another, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and longing. The sparks within them pulsed faintly, their light an insistent reminder. Eleanor clutched the orchid to her chest. Jacob stared at his hands. Maisie let her shadows twirl around her, her small face serene. None spoke, but all knew. The dawn would demand an answer. The night deepened, its silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock tower. The cloaked figure's words seemed to settle over the square like a veil, heavy and unyielding. The sparks, now nestled within their chosen hosts, pulsed faintly, their light a quiet reminder of the promise and the price that hung in the air. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the orchid in her hands. Its petals glowed with an otherworldly vibrancy, and yet there was a weight to its beauty that she couldn't ignore. The vision she'd seen, a vast field of flowers blooming in her wake, had stirred something deep within her, a yearning she hadn't known she possessed. But the figure's words echoed in her mind. A memory, a skill, a dream. Something precious must be given in return. What kind of choice is this? Jacob's voice broke through the silence, rough and uncertain. He stood with his arms crossed, the tools hovering around him like restless shadows. They dangle these powers in front of us, and expect us to give up pieces of ourselves. It's not fair." Maisie looked up at him, her expression calm and untroubled. "It's not unfair either," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight beyond her years. The shadows curled around her feet like obedient pets. "They're not forcing us. They're asking." Jacob scoffed, but his shoulders sagged. "Easy for you to say. You're just a kid. What could you possibly have to lose?" Maisie tilted her head, her dark eyes unreadable. "Everything," she said simply. "But maybe it's worth it." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "It's not just about what we lose," she said, looking around at the gathered townsfolk. "It's about what we gain. For years, I've lived quietly, tending to my books and my plants. But tonight, I saw something bigger, something I never thought I could be part of. And I can't pretend that doesn't matter." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uneasily. The cloaked figure watched silently from the shadows, their presence a quiet reminder of the choice that loomed before them. "What happens if we refuse?" someone asked, their voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, their movements fluid and deliberate. "Then the sparks will return to the stars, and your lives will continue as they were," they said. "No memory of this night will remain. It will be as though the magic never touched you." A hush fell over the square. The idea of returning to the ordinary, of forgetting the extraordinary possibilities they had glimpsed, seemed almost unbearable. And yet, the price of keeping the magic felt equally daunting. Jacob broke the silence, his voice tight with frustration. "What if the price is too high? What if we don't know what we're giving up until it's gone?" The figure regarded him for a long moment. "The price is always equal to the gift," they said. "The choice is yours to make." Maisie stepped forward, her small frame illuminated by the faint glow of the sparks. She looked up at the figure, her expression serene. "I want to keep it," she said. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "I'll give whatever it takes." Her parents gasped, but Maisie didn't look back. The shadows around her pulsed with light, their movements growing sharper and more deliberate. The figure nodded, their gloved hand reaching out to touch Maisie's forehead. A faint silver light flickered, and for a moment, Maisie's eyes closed. When she opened them again, the shadows around her seemed stronger, more alive. She turned to her parents, her gaze steady. "It's okay," she said. "I gave up my favorite dream. I don't need it anymore." Eleanor watched, her heart pounding. Maisie's choice had been simple, almost elegant. But what would her own price be? She thought of her late husband, of the memories she cherished. What if she had to give them up? Could she bear to lose even a piece of him? One by one, others began to step forward, their choices as varied as their gifts. A man surrendered his skill at painting, trading his artistry for the ability to heal. A woman gave up her memory of her childhood home, gaining the power to command the winds. Each time, the cloaked figure accepted their sacrifices with quiet solemnity, and the sparks within them grew brighter, their gifts solidifying. Eleanor clutched the orchid tighter, her mind racing. The magic within her called to her, promising something extraordinary, something beautiful. But the cost? She wasn't sure she could bear it. The clock struck 2, the sound deep and resonant. The cloaked figure turned to the remaining townsfolk, their voice low and melodic. The hour grows late. The choice cannot wait forever. Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers trembling. She looked at the orchid, at its vibrant petals, and made her decision. As she stepped forward, the sparks around her seemed to hum in approval, their light casting long, shifting shadows across the square. The final hours of the night wrapped Gloam in a velvet stillness, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock tower. The sparks had grown dimmer now, their restless flickering slowing to a steady rhythmic glow. Those who had made their choice stood in quiet contemplation, their new abilities thrumming beneath their skin. For some, it felt like a fire, vivid and consuming. For others, it was a whisper, a subtle but undeniable shift in their being. Eleanor stood near the fountain, her orchid glowing faintly in her hands. The sacrifice she'd made weighed heavily on her heart, though she tried not to show it. She had given up her most cherished memory, the warmth of her husband's hand in hers on the day they had planted the first sapling in their garden. The memory had been the root of her love for plants, for nurturing life. And now, though she could no longer recall the moment, the magic within her promised to create beauty wherever she walked. It was a bittersweet exchange, one she would carry silently. Jacob stood apart from the group, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His tools no longer hovered. They rested quietly at his feet. He hadn't made the choice. He couldn't. To him, the price had felt too steep, the risk too great. He glanced at Eleanor, at Maisie, at the others who had embraced the magic, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if he would regret his decision. But deep down, he told himself he hadn't lost anything. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything felt different. Maisie twirled in the square, her laughter soft but unrestrained. The shadows around her now moved with purpose, their shapes sharper and more defined. They formed intricate patterns on the cobblestones, weaving in and out of the light. Her parents watched her in silence, their expressions a mix of awe and unease. Maisie had given up her dreams, the innocent visions of fields and skies that had once filled her nights. In their place, she had gained a profound clarity, an understanding of the world's hidden corners. And though she was only a child, she seemed at peace with her decision. The cloaked figure stood at the base of the clock tower, their presence still and commanding. "The time approaches," they said. their voice soft yet resonant. For those who have chosen, the magic is yours. For those who have not, the sparks will leave you. Either way, the dawn comes. As if summoned by their words, the first slivers of light began to creep over the horizon, soft and tentative. The sparks, now faint and flickering, began to rise from those who had refused them. They drifted upward like fireflies, their glow fading as they disappeared into the sky. Jacob watched them go, a strange pang in his chest. For a brief moment, he thought he felt one hesitate near him, as if offering a second chance. But it moved on, vanishing into the growing light. Eleanor looked up, her breath catching as she saw the sparks depart. The ones that remained, those within her, within Maisie, within the others who had chosen, grew steadier, their light melding seamlessly with their hosts. She could feel the magic settle, no longer a foreign presence, but a part of her, as natural as her heartbeat. The cloaked figure stepped forward, their movements deliberate and fluid. "You have embraced the extraordinary," they said to the chosen. "But remember, it is not a gift to be squandered. It is a thread, fragile and precious, woven into the fabric of your being. Treat it with care." They turned to those who had refused, their tone no less gentle. "And you, who have chosen to remain as you were, carry no shame. The ordinary holds its own power. The sparks will remember you, and perhaps one day they will return." As the final chime of the clock tower rang out, the figure began to fade, their form dissolving into the light of the rising sun. "This night will become legend," they said, their voice growing distant. "But legends are merely beginnings." The dawn spilled across Gloam, washing the square in a soft, golden glow. The townsfolk stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For those who had accepted the magic, the world now felt vast and full of possibility. For those who had let it go, it was as though the night had been a fleeting dream, already slipping from memory. Eleanor glanced down at her orchid, its petals catching the sunlight. She couldn't recall the day she had planted her first garden, but she could feel the spark within her, a quiet, steady promise of life and growth. She smiled faintly, the ache of loss mingling with a newfound sense of purpose. Jacob walked back to his workshop, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He tried not to look back at the square, but the image of the sparks rising into the sky lingered in his mind. As he reached the door, he paused, staring at the tools on his bench. Something about them felt heavier now, as though they carried a weight he couldn't explain. Maisie skipped toward home, her shadows trailing behind her like faithful companions. She hummed a tune, her voice light and carefree, but her eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before. Her parents followed, their steps hesitant, unsure how to bridge the gap between their daughter and the strange, otherworldly being she had become. And as the town of Gloam stirred awake, the clock tower stood silent once more, its face dull and unremarkable. Yet somewhere in its shadow, a faint shimmer lingered, waiting for another time, another midnight, when the sparks would return to awaken destiny once again.